I investigated how Japanese role-playing games and Western role-playing games are easily confused within society. I answer this by presenting these genres into context by analytically defining the meaning of each genre, as well as how they are the subject of being classed as the same. I start by looking at the origins of role-playing games to aid my research on why the lines are blurred between subgenres. I look at why it is important that gamers are aware of the roles they play in these games to clarify my readings. As this happens, I put each genre into consideration for their qualities that are seen throughout gameplay. I take this further by comparing the genres with detailed analysis of games in this genre, including the juxtaposition and contrast that I identified in a case study of my choosing. I conclude my research by collectively defining what I have learnt from each genre and why we should be classifying certain games as individual genres. Role-playing games have revolutionized the world of gaming in an industry that continues to bring people together across the world. Everyone who has played a fair amount of video games all have a special title that caused healthy social lives to slowly drop, telling ourselves to keep on playing until ridiculous hours at night. Whether it's a timeless classic or a brand new experience of role-playing we have never seen before, our imaginations are treated to worlds and environments we couldn't comprehend in the real world. We all have our own opinions of where the best role-playing games come from, which has broadened this genre of video games. That's why I'm going to be looking at the differences between Western role-playing games and Japanese role-playing games. With this in mind, I will be exploring game aspects such as themes, methodology of game development, narrative, and game mechanics. This means that I will look at both continents in this genre as I gradually link them together and compare their structure as video games. Also, I will look at how these video games are seen individually within the same classification of a role-playing game, debating how they contrast each other by explaining what experiences they provide for players. Eventually, I will construct my conclusion based on what I have understood from critically analysing role-playing games, depicting what I have understood about each genre from academic resources. In order to explore this topic in full depth, I will be attempting to answer these questions. How are these games judged authentically when both genres are labelled as role-playing games from separate continents and cultures? What have they learned and developed from each other? What are the main aspects of these games and how do they define their genre? To be able to answer these questions effectively, I will be following these aims, which are identifying and comparing the characteristics of role-playing games from several continents and countries, looking at the difference between their individuality, understanding how developers have learned from different games from different cultures, and defining the genre of role-playing games through the analysis of their main qualities. Also, I'm going to be investigating 3 games in a comparative study, which are Skyrim from the USA, Sudeki from the UK, and Persona 5 from Japan. Before jetting off from Florida to Tokyo, we have to investigate what a role-playing game is. Role-playing games, which are commonly referred as RPGs, are a genre of video games that take place in an imaginary world, putting the player in the shoes of a fictional character known as the protagonist. Barton states that the critically acclaimed fantasy tabletop role-playing game called Dungeons & Dragons played a highly constructive role in developing the computer game industry, and mentions how CRPGs were deeply inspired from D&D. At first, role-playing games followed a set of basic elements that progress and develop during the game. These include levels or statistics that determine the strength of playable characters in a party, a menu-based combat system that provides all of the mechanics for the gameplay, and a storyline that follows through an objective which eventually works its way towards an end goal or a purpose for the protagonist. There are also subgenres of RPGs, such as action RPGs, adventure RPGs, and strategy RPGs. There's a lot more where that came from. Nowadays, RPGs will follow through with these elements, or developers will come up with elements that aren't normally incorporated into this genre. Now that we know what types of video games we are looking at, we can start to analyse these different continents I have chosen to investigate one by one. The first continent I will be investigating is Japanese role-playing games. Better known as JRPGs, they are a genre of role-playing games that are developed and mainly published in Japan. These games traditionally revolve around the leading role of the protagonist that is given to the player. One of the most reused elements in this genre is the menu-based combat system, since they are well known for sticking within turn-based gameplay. This has been executed multiple times from the Final Fantasy series and is among one of the top publishing games that faithfully revisit this formula, gradually building up on improvements to further advance this type of gameplay. Kalata states that Final Fantasy VII was the driving point for JRPGs going in the mainstream, with its flashy full motion cutscenes, and a vast majority of JRPGs have been translated into English after the game was released in 1997. Another reoccurring feature is the ease of use during gameplay, allowing players to execute commands for each party member at their disposal with a clear description of what each command does. In the majority of JRPGs, we are able to fight enemies with regular physical attacks, cast magic for offense or defense, and using consumable items that typically restore the fighting condition of the player's party members. Consalvo and Dutton mentioned that Final Fantasy allows players to have a virtual mega pharmacy of healing items to aid their party inside and outside of battle. Before a battle is commenced, the player is taken to a different area known as the battlefield that acts as a wider spread environment which provides a single angle view during gameplay. Normally we are given between 4 to 8 characters to choose from in battle to stop ourselves from becoming overwhelmed. According to Shinya Nashizaki, JRPGs were amongst the first contributors of storytelling, becoming their unique selling point on a digital format, just like books and films. Even today, a lot of games from this genre hold on to their roots as they present what first put JRPGs in the mainstream. For example, I Am Setsuna implemented these traditional elements into modern gaming, creating a sense of nostalgia whilst delivering an emotionally driven message. For those who wish for a more down-to-earth experience, there are a lot of games that provide effective use of comedy, or in this case, friendly banter. In games such as Star Ocean: The Last Hope and Tales of Berseria, gamers are offered the opportunity to build relationships and learn interesting facts about important characters that the player will grow accustomed towards. This allows us to choose who we wish to spend more time with in-game, which will eventually lead to long-lasting friendships and even sexual relationships. With this opportunity, players can simulate themselves with characters as if they were real. As the game progresses, we are able to learn more about their personalities and preferences. The CRPG project discusses how the Mass Effect trilogy created a successful blend of cinematic action RPGs with a strong squad member relationship element. When it comes to JRPGs, it is difficult for us to relate with a protagonist that has been introduced from the creators, since we may have different interests and opinions. This is where WRPGs seize this advantage, with the use of high fantasy gameplay and providing character creation mechanics. Straight away, we can give the tools in emulating our visual appearance and even our personalities in certain RPGs. Since WRPGs have been mentioned, we're going to move on to Western role-playing games. More commonly known as WRPGs, this genre of video games is developed and published from the USA. Similar to JRPGs, we are presented with a vital role in the narrative. However, WRPGs typically allow us to choose what the protagonist will look like, what skills the character will be able to use, and which paths the player will follow during gameplay. With the access for high fantasy elements, they provide a feeling of freedom over the limitations of receiving a role in a plotline created and set by the developers. For example, Dragon Age Inquisition takes place in a fantasy world that is slowly being taken over by a mysterious unknown force, and it's up to the player, known as the Inquisitor, to fight for humanity. However, the gender or race of the protagonist is not forced upon the player. Similar games to this provide lots of customizable features for creating unique characters with the capacity to adjust face complexity, skin tones, the character's voice, and even their race, such as elf or dwarf. Nowadays, WRPGs don't follow the traditional turn-based combat system that was originally established. Instead, this genre embraces real-time battle sequences to immerse the player into the flow of combat. This style of gameplay attracts players with the realism of striking down foes and giving a sense of power and brutality in combat. However, some WRPGs bring back elements of traditional RPGs. An example of this can be noticed in Fallout 3. This game first introduced Stats mode. Inspired from their tactical RPG origins, this command slows down and pauses in-game movement to allow the player to scan a target. A menu is displayed to perform a focus strike on a particular part of the enemy's body, followed by the success rate of the attack landing on the target. Although it may seem negative that WRPGs don't execute the gameplay origins of RPGs, this does however provide a smooth transition from gameplay to combat. A lot of games from this genre do not change from a different scene or battlefield whilst the player is exploring the environment or moving towards an objective in the game. But this can cause confusion when combat is commenced, forcefully putting the player into a devastating disadvantage and unintentional situations. Another feature that can be seen in WRPGs is their efforts on breaking the barrier of displaying top quality graphics. Not only do these crisp graphics captivate the scenery, but also draws in the player into an immersive experience. Furthermore, the player's perception of reality and video games are brought closer together, with visuals becoming almost identical to each other. Barton claims that immersion is much easier in cases where the virtual reality is as much like our reality as possible. The more familiar everything feels, the less we notice the machinery behind the illusion. From this statement, I can see how this genre favours PC platforms over home console platforms such as Nintendo, since the consoles are not capable of implementing visual details and graphics to a high standard as a PC. The Last Boas discusses that hardware inside a gaming PC can far outperform the parts in a console like the Xbox One or PlayStation 4, and games on PC can play with graphics settings set to higher levels as well as play at higher, smoother frame rates than that on a console. As I am satisfied with these statements that define each genre very highly, I will be moving on to my chosen case studies. For my comparative investigation, I will be comparing 3 video games that fit into the category as an RPG. I have selected Persona 5, The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and Sudeki. With these titles, I can analyse the main aspects of JRPGs and WRPGs in comparison, as I highlight their ethnic qualities in the gaming industry. In order to achieve this objective, I will start by describing and critically analysing each game methodically. The first game I will be looking at is Persona 5. Persona 5 is a role-playing game released on the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4. This game was first published in Japan on September 15th, 2016 from a company called Atlus. In Japan, P Studio developed this game as they are the designated development team of the Persona series. As well as being part of the Persona series, this game is also an addition to the much wider Japanese franchise known as Megami Tensei. Persona 5 provides the role of a nameless 16-year-old high school student with an alter ego of the Trickster, referred as Joker, he who will save the souls of humanity, and the leader of the Phantom Thieves. The protagonist, known as Akira Karuzu in the manga, is falsely accused of harassing a woman, which leads to him being sent to Japan, Tokyo. Taking place in the ordinary world, he finds new friends whilst attending Sujin Academy, who eventually become members of the Phantom Thieves. This group are able to explore an alternate world from the fabrication of twisted and subconscious desires from adults with evil intents. In the metaverse, they awaken to the power of their personas and gain the capacity to bring righteousness to an unjust world. One of the most notable aspects of Persona 5 is how gameplay does not solidly rely on the plotline. As well as being able to explore the metaverse to battle dark entities known as shadows in a turn-based combat system, the player is able to engage in an almost accurate life simulation with a vast amount of interactions in the world. This includes taking part in a burger eating competition, playing in the batting cages, dining at local restaurants, and relaxing in the nearby bathhouse. The last activity may not be for everyone. These activities are one of the many things available for the player, but are all restricted to a day-night cycle, meaning there is so little you can do each day, and enforces the emphasis of taking your time during gameplay. The loading icon is no illusion. Another feature to this game is building confidants with non-playable characters or NPCs and fellow members of the Phantom Thieves. Not only do they offer unique social interactions to take place, but they allow the player to gain abilities that will help in and out of combat. On top of that, female characters are able to be romanced by extending their confidant level to the near highest rank. This extends the playability since there are a lot of different outcomes and possibilities with each character. For example, if the player decides to have multiple romantic partners, this will be noticed during Valentine's Day in-game and will cause these affected characters to lose interest in the protagonist. Although this provides a lot of immersion for different types of players, this game avoided the possibility of allowing same-sex relationships with these confidants. This was a major letdown for some players, since it was discovered that there was coding in the previous installment of the Persona series. In Persona 4, the coding allowed the male protagonist to use romantic social choices with a male character called Kanji Tatsumi, a teenager who was unsure of the opposite sex. However, this was struck from the final product and did not bring this sexual preference into the limelight, raising further concern for the representation of the LGBTQ community. There are two minor characters featured in certain cutscenes of Persona 5. They are the only explicitly gay characters in the whole game. Also, their appearance is referred as stereotypical and over-exaggerated. In some cases this was used for humorful purposes, but it cannot dodge the fact that it can be seen as offensive for people who fall victim to this type of terminology based on their behaviour and appearance. Ferguson states, "Diversity is reprimanded in our society because a majority of people maintain superficial and fictitious static identity categories in order to homogenize themselves in a collective sense that benefits society in numerous ways." That brings me to my next title that does provide this feature, Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Skyrim is an action-adventure role-playing game that is set in a fictional world called Tamriel, the area where all of the Elder Scrolls games take place. We are taken to the northern region of Tamriel, which shares the same name as the game, Skyrim. Unlike Persona 5, this game allows us to have a fully customizable character surrounded by the role as the protagonist. As the game begins, the protagonist is captured by the Imperial Legion for illegally crossing the borders of Skyrim with the Stormcloaks. Along with other stragglers, the player is sentenced to death. However, everyone is shocked to see that a dragon has come crashing down in the middle of the execution. As everyone flees, the player is guided to escape the dragon's destruction from a Stormcloak soldier called Rayloff. Eventually, the first decision of the game is presented to the character by deciding to escape with an Imperial soldier called Hadvar or continue to follow Rayloff. With different events happening based on the previous decision, the player escapes and eventually reaches a city called Whiterun. Upon arrival, the protagonist is tasked with assisting the Jarl of Whiterun to slay a dragon before it reaches the city and causes more mayhem in the area. As the dragon is defeated, the player absorbs the soul of the dragon. This is when the name Dragonborn is referred to the character. The plotline continues with the player discovering the hidden power of the Dragonborn through the assistance of the Greybeards. As the Greybeards teaches the protagonist how to master the power of dragon shouts, this allows the player to discover new shouts from collecting pieces of dragon language inside dungeons. By using a dragon soul to unlock more shouts, this encourages players to track down these mythical creatures to gain these unique powers in Skyrim. Since this game does not have a linear sequence, the player can decide to take part in side quests, join up with powerful groups such as the Dark Brotherhood, or freely explore the wilderness of Skyrim. This includes a wide selection of weapons and magic to suit the player's preferred style of combat. Also, these preferences can be enhanced by using skill points that are acquired whenever the character levels up. Not only does experience increase whenever a skill gains more power, the player can focus on any chosen skill. This means that the player can choose to be a magic caster or a ferocious warrior and gain experience in an equal manner according to the power of these skills. All types of weapons have their own skill trees that powers up the usefulness of each weapon, meaning you can choose your favourite weapon type and become very powerful in this specialisation. Although it's lovely to be spoilt for choice, there is however a downside to the game's mechanics. A lot of these faults can cause devastating consequences to the player's progress, since it's impossible to save or fast travel whilst engaging in battle with a foe. One of these issues is how the movement whilst using a weapon feels too realistic, with a heavy feeling pressed against the player's weight, which can take away the enjoyment of fighting enemies. Another concern was that the game is too easy even when the difficulty is increased and lacks a challenge for hardcore gamers. However, Skyrim showed off pleasing graphics for its time in 2011. Thanks to a hugely dedicated modding community, fans continue to surprise the developers with mods that enhance the visuals further and even create more content for players to experience in an already vast open world. Showing further how this game has stood the test of time, an upgraded version of this game called The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim Special Edition was released on October 28th, 2016 for PlayStation 4, Xbox One and PC. As well as implementing a lot of improvements on the game's performance, the graphics were enhanced and improved by the developers called Bethesda Game Softworks. If this wasn't enough, the modding community shares a wealth of mods on visual improvements and other related modifications. Since these additions to the game are not from the developers, it is common for players to come across mods that can cause the game to crash, glitch, and trigger the possibility of losing game save data. Also, overflooding the game with modifications will lose the sense of the original game, and the authenticity slowly starts to vanish. Another negative is that the game achievements are locked when the game has been modified. Even technology bigwigs Sony disagreed with Bethesda on allowing user mods to be available on the PlayStation 4, since this could cause potential hackers to strike their PlayStation servers. Next, I'm going to be looking at the next title, Sudeki. Sudeki is an action role-playing game that was created in the UK from a development team called Climax Studios. This game was released for Xbox on July 20th, 2004, and later released for PC on March 25th, 2005. The story focuses on 4 characters who join forces to fight against an otherworldly threat known as the Achlorians. Over time, they discover their true purpose as their hidden powers are granted to them from the mighty gods and demigods of Sudeki, a world that was torn apart and separated into 2. Taking place in the world of Illumina, these heroes share the bond from the world of Sudeki and are destined to restore the balance that once existed. Since this game was not published from the other continents I have explored, this does not classify into one of the subgenres I am investigating. Sudeki has struck a chord with both genres, taking a page from each of their gaming aspects, but this leaves it as a unique RPG compared to Japan and the USA. In particular, the gameplay does not favour in either genre over the other. There are a lot of differences between Persona 5 and Skyrim. What makes this game stand out is having the choice of which character to control with their individual playstyles, being able to perform skills that submit the flow of battle into slow motion, story progression that has the player swap between different characters in the party at certain points, and alternating between first-person shooting and third-person slashing. Despite the game specialising in real-time battle, the use of skills that provides an edge and upper hand portrays a true sense of role-playing, since each character has unique skills that can only be used by the player controlling the character in context. This is heavily seen in JRPGs, whereas WRPGs avoid complicating character skill sets. With a sense of individuality, the party has a selection of characters that appeal to most players, whether they like to use the magical powers of Ailish, with her first-person staff blasting capabilities, or Tal, specialising in close-range combat and powerful skills that will devastate the battlefield. In a sense, Sudeki acts as a hyperbreed of these genres, since the artistic style leans towards what is widely noticed in JRPGs, similar to anime, which has a heavy influence on the characters, and provides real-time battle features seen in a vast amount of WRPGs. Also, this game does not allow any customization features, which further show similarities to JRPGs. However, there are no signs of turn-based gameplay throughout, and the battlefield does not change the environment outside of combat. The feel to this game favours JRPGs, but it operates and functions as a typical WRPG. Based off all of the findings in this investigation, I have come to my conclusion of these genres. I have discovered that Japanese role-playing games have set their mark in the gaming industry by establishing the functions of a traditional role-playing game, but acquires a style from their ethnicity and cultural influences such as anime and manga. The focus is heavily within style over substance, as Japanese developers want to take players on a journey, being guided through a role that tells a story, with a setting, world, and evidence of living from the characters that are shown and provided for players. Their use of turn-based gameplay has played a part in continuing the traditions in the origins of role-playing games. But just like Western role-playing games, they tend to change direction with the use of incorporating genres and styles. I noticed that this applies to video games that follow the footsteps in either continent, and steers a new direction in role-playing games. Although there are limitations to the possibilities of JRPGs, there is evidence that there is a chance for this genre to blossom and to experiment with a role that could excite new players, but reminds newer generations that the origins are what made role-playing games what they are now. For Western role-playing games, I have understood that they take pride in bringing a world to freely explore without any limits, and sustains the freedom of choice, whether it's for the character's attire or ways to play with reference in mind. There is a world that is in a fantasy, and tricks the eye into realism through highly structured graphics, but also allows the player to explore it by their pace. Players are reminded that the world they engage with is fictional, but does not shy away from conveying emotion and connections that are experienced in reality. The role of the protagonist is paved by the player's choices and decisions, influencing the events in the storyline, and are offered opportunities to discover fictional relationships with characters capable of forming a bond. This genre has represented a vast amount of gameplay that was not comprehended or witnessed several years ago. They remind the world that pre-existing elements in video games can be altered and adapted into a role where choice is of the peak interest. I hope you all enjoyed my journey, and thank you for watching.